is DevOps Radio, a monthly podcast exploring the ideas, approaches, best practices, and people that create and deliver the software and applications that the world needs at the pace it demands. It's the Wild West out there, and the laws are meant to be broken. So let's explore the conventional, the unconventional, what worked, what didn't, and what might. Broadcasting from the beating heart of Los Angeles, here's your host, Sean Ahmed.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to DevOps Radio episode number 4. We're really happy to have you here with us today. Today we're going to be discussing a topic of DevOps, successful, some challenging implementations through the eye and lens of two industry veterans. I'm going to be later in the show introducing the founder of Hudson Project, Jenkins, Kohsuke Kawaguchi. He is with us here today. And we have the Chief Strategy Officer and founder of CloudBees, Sacha Labourey, with us today as well. We're going to not only be discussing how they've seen the world and how they've seen the implementation, both the good ones, some of the challenging ones, and how data, machine learning, and artificial intelligence potentially may play a part not only now, but also into the future of this particular subject. Now, to kick us off, I want to kick us off with a really interesting company and the head of marketing there, Ian O'Brien, because Launchable is such a fascinating company to me. Among many companies out there, they are kind of the first, should I say, potentially trailblazer in using data and ML for both practical and strategic use cases. And in mostly in a practical use case sense, we'll be discussing with Ian how they have taken data and machine learning and applied it to some interesting test use cases. So, Ian, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Sean, for having me. I am so excited to be here, and that was a lovely introduction.
Thanks for being with us. So, Ian, take a minute and tell us a little bit about the hypothesis behind Launchable. What were you guys seeing in the market that led you to take the bet that data and ML is the way to go?
Sure. So for a moment, I would like to speak on behalf of Kohsuke, our founder, who obviously needs no introduction. But the hypothesis behind Launchable really is that he was sitting in some meetings and feeling like he was hearing presentations from marketers like yourself and myself, and just having this tsunami of data available to us, where we're able to make data-driven decisions based on thousands, if not tens of thousands of different data points. And then when it came time for the engineering team to present, they really weren't being as data-driven and really in any the same order of magnitude. And so his hypothesis was, maybe I can come up with a solution to be more data-driven about engineering. And up until this point, I'm sure as all the engineers who are listening know, mostly developer productivity and health of code repos is really around commit volume and how many lines of code. And I think anybody who listens to that thinks there's no way to judge the quality of that.
Right.
So really being data-driven is looking more deeper into what goes into producing great software. And really the hypothesis here is there's a lot of information that can be gleaned specifically from the way that you're testing, and Launchable takes a look through all the metadata and through all the code and understands when tests are going to fail and uses the Launchable machine learning brain in order to learn data about each different repository as you're pushing data to it. Now, this is obviously only the first step in Launchable's plan to be data-driven for engineering, but we think with our way of productizing what's called predictive test selection, that we're really onto a new way of looking at the health of software, no matter where it's built in any type of application in the world.
Ian, thank you for that explanation. That makes a lot of sense. So for our audience, I'm kind of wondering, as we think about how the technology actually works, what does it do? How does it work?
Sure. So Launchable is a machine learning brain that takes a look at each code change that happens and looks at when those code changes fail within your test pipeline. The more data we get, and it usually takes between 4 to 6 weeks, we've recently gotten it down to 4 weeks. It takes a look at those changes, and the more frequently that we see failures associated with specific changes, our signal improves. And so we learn, oh, okay, these tests are more likely to fail. Now, we then are able to create a subset of those tests. So we can look and see which of your tests are going to fail, and we're going to move those in what we call shift left. So we're going to understand which of your tests are more likely to fail, so you're not spending 5 or 6 hours of your nightly build going through maybe tens of thousands of tests that actually aren't going to fail, and you're not going to get any new data from them. So what Launchable does is it takes this and it's unique to every customer, which is why we use the ML model. But what it does is it correlates these two values together so we understand, hey, actually, you should probably run these tests first. And the reason why you should run them first is because we can achieve a confidence interval, and we like to say above 90% or above, where we say, all right, these tests are going to fail. You're going to test them first. You're going to be able to get through your build maybe 5 times faster than you were previously.
Okay. So you take tests, you take the metadata around the test, you're looking at different types of code changes as they're being pushed back into the repo, and you're correlating essentially the changes and the associated test results and determining a subset of tests that are the most likely to fail, run those instead of running the whole entire gamut. Did I
Correct.
understand
Correct.
that? Okay.
Yes.
So that's unique for every customer, like you said. So how long does it take for a particular user, let's say, to build the training set for that, given that out of the box, the system doesn't know what those correlations are? So do you have to spend time teaching the system that?
Yeah, we do. So as most people know, within any ML system, it really has to learn. You have to train a model. And how much data you feed it is how accurate those tests are going to be over time. So like I said previously, we've gotten that down to be about 4 weeks. So if we get you into a POC where we start actually receiving your data, we then work with you in order to get that testing cadence up to a point where we can get enough information to be able to make recommendations to you after about 4 weeks. And we give you the thumbs up or thumbs down to say, hey, maybe Launchable is going to be a great fit for your organization.
Right. That's really cool. Now, if you're looking towards, the order of magnitude when we talk about improvement that comes from that, how does it impact our developer on a day-to-day basis? Like, okay, so you taught the system this, a developer is working. Give me the before and the after.
Sure. So let me back up a little bit from your question there and wax a little bit poetical about developers and engineers. I think that really today more and more is being asked of a developer than ever before. It was famously claimed some years ago that software will eat the world. And if software is going to eat the world, then ostensibly software engineers or developers are the harbingers of that digital change. And so if we're constantly being asked to put more and more on the shoulders of developers, really that results in them being more stressed. They're needing to juggle things that they weren't being asked to before. I was previously a front-end engineer, and what does that even mean anymore? Any front-end engineer today really has to run the full stack in order to make anything work. They're working in React. They're pulling data from an API. That's not what a front-end developer is supposed to be doing. So that can be extrapolated to all different kinds of developers and engineers around the world. We're expecting our software to work flawlessly the first time, and especially when it comes to market, because it costs money, it costs energy. And so what that at the lowest level and the closest to the work is that engineers are unhappy. We're seeing all of these jobs pop up that are about developer experience and about developer happiness, dedicated director and VP level roles about developer happiness. So what we want to do is we want to shine a light on the individuals who are doing this work and enable them to have the tools to be able to do their work better. There's a wonderful comic that's, I think, by XKCD that's out there where it's these two engineers who are sword fighting, and someone calls from the other room saying, "Hey, what are you guys doing?" And they're saying, "Oh, we're waiting for our code to test." And he goes, "Oh, okay, carry on." So what we're really truly doing is we're giving productivity back to the developers to be able to focus on the work that they do best and not have to have them keep pushing with these tests forward. Why is this failing? Why is this failing? Why is this failing? Which results in them being very frustrated. They get upset. They want to leave. They want to work for an organization that has a more mature CI/CD and testing infrastructure.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, Ian. So what's next? So you guys are focused on this test scenario. Where do you learn? What can you learn from other data sets?
Well, that's a good question. I think that probably Kohsuke is a better person to ask about that in terms of the future of AI and ML. In fact, he and I had a disagreement about whether or not we should even call it AI. So I am on the side of, hey, that's what everyone calls it, and so maybe we should use the term that everyone uses. And he very politely, nods his head at me, and I think that he lets me have my way in terms of my opinion, but he definitely has a separate one in terms of what AI actually is. I think that any of these engines are an ability for us to do things at scale. So we want to be able to create solutions that enable people to do their best work. And what machine learning is really designed for, and where it shows its power, is doing these very repetitive tasks that don't need a human to be able to sit there and analyze it. And the great thing about these models is they train and they get better over time. So one of the things that ML can be really good at, separate from testing, is identifying what somebody's face looks like and then tagging them in photos. I think anybody who's uploaded a photo to Facebook and they say, "Oh, do you want to tag yourself?" And you kind of go, "Wow, how does Facebook know that that's my face?"
Yeah.
Kind of understands the ability of using these models at scale. So our goal here is to create these systems, programs, pieces of software that improve developer happiness, improve developer productivity, and is going to save your company in terms of hiring engineers, in terms of how quickly you can bring your product to market. And really, our ultimate goal is to focus on the continuous quality of what we're doing. We want to look at code quality. No one today is really looking at what is the quality of your code. Like I talked about earlier, it's all about commit volume, lines of code, but how do you evaluate how good code is? And we think that we have the introduction to understanding that problem. And I think we're one of the first people to really, one of the first companies to really take this on.
Well, Ian, fascinating company, fascinating technology. I can't wait to see what you guys do next. And thanks for being on the show with us to give us a little preview of Launchable and explaining to us how the technology works. Wish you guys nothing but success and all the best to you guys, because you guys are really trailing the blaze, or blazing the trail, whichever way that saying goes, right? Being a trailblazer for machine learning in the world of DevOps, and you guys have taken the bold first few steps and found some use cases to go after. So all the best to you guys here in the future.
Well, thank you very much, Sean. We're extremely excited to be here, and thank you very much for having us.
We're going to move to the next segment of the show, and here's a thought. It's clear over the last 2 decades that companies have both succeeded and been challenged in their DevOps implementations. And whether it's implementing it as a practice, whether it's the tool, the people, the organization, it's worth talking about some of those challenges and some of the good ones to kind of reflect on what they have been over the years. Now, it's also worth thinking about data and what Ian and Launchable is doing, which is using the data that's presumably been collected over 20 years worth of implementation effort, and see if we can use that in a more practical sense, maybe even a strategic sense. And for that, I am super excited to bring onto the show 2 industry veterans that I introduced at the start of the show to come and talk exactly about that. So Kohsuke and Sacha, both of you, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's good to be back with the old colleagues.
It sure is. It sure is. It's been a while. And Sacha, welcome to you as well.
Thank you. So you call me a veteran, right?
Oh boy. How did I know that was coming? Oh, well, I say it with the utmost amount of respect, Sacha, for both of you guys. If we're talking about the other kind of veteran, look at my head and hair, you'll tell I'm not. I'm the real veteran here.
All right. Good to see you again. I haven't seen you for a few hours yet. So,
yeah, right? That's
happy to be here.
Yeah, we happen to work at the same company, but it's fun to do this as well, you know. Kohsuke, where about in the world are you today?
I'm in San Jose, California. I'm stuck at my home for a good long while.
Yeah. Well, I hope you and your family and everybody's doing well and is safe from what has been 2 years of pandemics.
Yeah, you'd be shocked to hear my new hobbies that I developed, but we'll save that for another occasion.
Okay, all right. Sounds good. I look forward to that. And Sacha, you whereabouts in the world are you today for our audience? Obviously, I know, but where are you today?
Switzerland, where I some people think I live or work in the US, but I've never ever lived in the US. So I'm actually hiding in Switzerland.
Okay, hiding is the last thing I would say because your work hours are kind of crazy. How do you manage that, living in Switzerland but with colleagues in the U.S.? I mean, you must be working every evening.
Yeah, there are tense period of time where I don't do much. I feel like I'm waking up with CloudBees and I'm going to sleep with CloudBees and I'm eating CloudBees. So yeah, it's time zone differences can be tough in a remote work environment, but it's not always, right?
Yeah, and CloudBees and Keike, you both Kohsuke have worked together for almost a decade. You guys were always remote, right? You guys never really were connected in an office per se. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. We started working, co-founders 2010. And we worked for about a decade before Kohsuke started his new venture, and we never worked in the same office. So I would fly to the US a lot. We also had meetings in other places in the world. So we had an amazing one in Japan as well that Kohsuke had organized, but no, never a physical office where we would be.
Yeah, we used to joke that we don't like each other. You know, like the closest distance between two engineers was like 50 miles for a good long while. But this, remote DNA is something I took to this new company. So I have a distributed team as well. So we're quite.
Do you think we'll ever go back to an office setting, Kohsuke? I mean, do you think we'll just be stuck in offices anymore? I mean, I don't think that's the future. But what's your thought?
Well, I guess I'm in the minority. I do like going into the office, for this context switching and having conversation with the colleague. But to your point, I don't think it's coming back. So I just have to adjust it.
Yeah. Well, I sure like also from time to time to see my colleagues in person. If there was a proper balance, I would absolutely have it. But yeah, it does seem like. Most of those who we speak to on this show are kind of saying, doesn't look like we're ever going to go back truly to the what it was like before. But let's get to topic. All right, you guys have both seen the good, the bad, and the ugly of the last 2 decades of DevOps implementations. And so, Kohsuke, let's start with you. What's an example of something you've seen that you thought was an immensely challenging situation for a company when implementing DevOps?
Yeah, so I guess the lighthouse DevOps teams that the industry thinks of, they all kind of do things the one way, like a one blessed way. And I've seen some teams that are super productive in this manner. But most of the development teams that I come across aren't that uniform in the way they do things. It's a large organization with lots of different teams doing things differently. So when I talk to the DevOps team in that setup, they really struggle to make an impact because there are so many teams doing things differently. So when I try to put myself in their shoes, I always wonder, what I would do. I can only really talk about some abstract fluffy concept and hope that the people on the ground make the impact. But it's so that's a tough battle that they fight. Another kind of extreme is the people closer to the ground trying to do some heroic things despite the like organizational structure or whatnot. And again, I try to put myself in their shoes, and what the things that they seem to be doing is all sensible, but like how far can you go if you have like a swimming against the current? So those are two different ends of the challenges that I think about a lot.
Yeah. Do you think, Kohsuke, sometimes it's just taking on a little bit too much all at the same time when you're sort of beginning, and maybe that's where some of the challenges stem from? It's the idea you want to take on not only the organizational aspect, but the practical aspect, the tooling aspect. Is there a practical sort of take one step at a time, learn how to crawl, then walk, then run type of approach to this?
Yeah, exactly. Like when they have to tackle that kind of big thing, and I worry about can they make enough impact before the whole thing gets canceled. I know the bosses can be short attention deficit disorder. Like, no disrespect intended, Sacha, but sometimes. So yeah, but I don't know. Again, the sometimes in those situations like I don't see how they can do any better at times, and that makes me feel humbled.
Yeah. Sacha, what about you? What are some of the challenging implementations you've seen, and what repeats itself?
We need to have a lot of empathy. It's hard, right? To do it right. So it's not like by default you do it right, and then you have a bunch of morons who screw up, and we look at them and say, oh, they're bad. No, it's hard. By default you screw up, right? It's kind of how many times do you screw up before you get right? So it's a journey. One case that was frustrating to me was in the automotive industry, because sometimes you have the willing people, you have they thought about it, they have the money, they have a lot of things right, and then you realize, like in the automotive industry, you have the OEM, you have the tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 vendors. So it makes like those complicated pipelines of providers. And imagine, right? Think about the diesel issues that we had a few years back, like a decade ago. Well, you end up with a binary that's working in a piece of hardware, but you don't know if it's actually the source code that's related to that. So legally, you can ask for the source code, but you only really get the bits because you're unable to build that. So you end up with the universe of code, which might or might not represent what's running in any car. And then you have bits. And so like this makes people uneasy, right? And then if you try to make those things be closer, right? Because you want to say, oh, well, I need a fix on a tier 1 type of environment. It needs to come back almost by waves to the OEM. It can take forever. And so if you try to fix that, you end up in lots of legal issues, actually, because it's not just like engineers sitting down and saying, yeah, let's fix it. It's actually easy to fix. But the problem is when you go back and tell those people, yeah, we want to test your code, we want to build your code, we want to be doing all kind of flexible things, then that gets very tense from a legal standpoint. So that's an example where I've seen companies really struggle. And engineers really be frustrated because they know the solutions, they know how to fix it, but the legal framework is just a decade too late or 2 decades late on that front.
That's a really interesting point, Sacha. I mean, I wonder sometimes, when we look back at how DevOps implementation practically were done, or where, when Kohsuke started with Hudson Project and Jenkins, the idea that you were sort of at the very early stages of continuous integration, you were trying to get your pipelines automated. It seemed like it was potentially an easier world for developers to kind of get code to market. But then as DevOps have evolved from that point and to where it is today, there's a lot more people involved. There's a lot more scrutiny involved. There's a lot more regulation, compliance, et cetera, et cetera. There seems to be a lot more around the developer today that presumably would make DevOps more difficult to do. Am I getting that right? Do you guys see that, Kohsuke or Sacha?
So those like a compliance and regulatory realities that Sacha described, like a very real and present. It has always been like that. Actually, it's just that they haven't been the kind of key friction point until we got better at certain things. So in some sense, we removed one obstacle so that they can face this next exciting obstacle that they face. Yeah. And so those are, I guess, in what I, again, what's make me, well, those are what makes me like humbling. I used to think, hey, like we built this hammer, so now it's they whack at it, and then they come back with all these contexts that make sense that like I have no good answer for.
Yeah. Now, let me ask you both a question. Was there a time when you two guys were working together in the days of CloudBees where you guys came out of a meeting? And I'm just imagining this moment in my head where you both looked at each other and you guys were like, "Oh my God, we got to get out of here. This was crazy." Has there ever been a moment like that when you guys saw a DevOps implementation or a challenge? You guys were like, "Oh my goodness, this is nuts."
Well, personally, it's always more of the political things that freaks me out. Because, we can talk about technology, we can build tools, you can find budget, you can do all kind of things. But when there is a personal deadlock, a systemic deadlock within the organization, especially as a vendor, there is nothing you can do. There is just nothing. So, you can try to expose the problem or try, and plus it's sensitive, but that's kind of things you can do, but there is a limit as to how far you can go. And you pretty much need to wait for the system to resolve itself, which can take a long time. And sometimes you see that, right? You see an organization where they will tell you, "Oh, we don't do cloud, we don't do this, we don't do that." And they have like 100 good reasons that feel like they've been built in stone. Then a CIO changes or a chief architect or some key role just changes and they call you the week after. Yeah, so now we need X, Y, and Z. And it's like a different company. So sometimes you just need to wait. It takes time.
Yeah.
Since you mentioned about getting out of here, one that I do remember in the very early days of CloudBees, like we went into one of the tech giants in the Silicon Valley, and he started describing the challenges he had, and we started describing the solution we had back then. And like in 10 minutes, it was pretty clear that they were far ahead than where we are. So in the middle of that call, I think he was a VP of engineering or director of engineering. He basically politely asked us to get fuck off. So we just, so we went at it. Thanks for coming, but looks like thanks for coming, but no, thank you. So we agreed. So we walked out, and I was with Harpreet and then we looked at each other. Wow, did we just get kicked out? And yeah, I think he did the right thing. So thank you.
They say you haven't been a leader at a software vendor unless you've been kicked out of a meeting at least once. So congratulations.
Yeah, I still remember that.
That's funny. Now, let me ask you this though. On the flip side, you guys in those days and even now are probably seeing some of the most successful, sort of most complex, and the most difficult implementations of DevOps, be it people, be it process, practice, tools. You've probably seen it all. And so what are some examples either of you or both of you have seen recently that have been great implementation? And then when they do that, what in particular stood out to you as this is what these folks are doing that's different and more successful than what others are doing?
Yeah, so should I take this one first? Yeah, so the one thing that I still remember I saw in Israel, they weren't too big of a company. They were, I think, maybe a couple of hundred engineers, and there's this one DevOps team, which basically they control the entire delivery pipeline. So their team members can go in, make a change, and then be done with it. and next morning their engineers would come in and notice that something like I got faster. And then so when I saw that when the team has that level of direct control over the delivery pipeline, instead of going through the developers and working with them to instigate the change, this DevOps team could do like amazing things super fast. And because this one team owns everything, the app developers don't need to do anything at all. So somehow there's this like a positive feedback loop going that the app developers can appreciate that they don't have to like worry about these grand details of the delivery pipeline, and the DevOps team are more efficient. In contrast, in like I guess the opposite example that I'm more used to seeing is the app developers feel like they need to be in charge of how their delivery pipeline works, so they can try to guard those, which makes the DevOps team less efficient. So I don't know, like I still don't know what got them to that point. Like it's like a self-reinforcing cycle, but to get to that point must have been hard. But once you get there, it's amazing.
Yeah. Sacha, what about you?
Yeah, since we all talk about how hard it is and so on, I think it's where you need to have leaders, technical leaders, you need to have business leaders. It needs to come from all sides, and you need to have like a clear vision. And at point, you need to have inflection points, right? You can't just do more of the same. Let's do the same but faster. It doesn't work this way, right? And anytime you have those inflection point, it's something happens, and that's beautiful when it happens, right? And we've seen several of those. For people interested in this, there is an old book in old because of our time frame, right? It goes very fast. But you might remember this book from Gary Groover, Leading the Transformation. It was 2006 or whatever, talking about HP LaserJet division, right? And they had like, I don't remember exactly, but it was like, they only had like 5% of the total product capacity that was focused on features. They were in the mud, completely in the mud, couldn't deliver anything. And the business had completely ignored the fact that anything could happen. It's like, okay, we're selling this. It's always going to be this and game over, essentially. And what's amazing here, it's not just about CI and CD, especially because you're selling physical goods, right? It's about at some point saying, well, if we want that, we're going to have to change the architecture. We're going to have a single foundation for all of the printers and so on. So it goes beyond. And you need to take a bigger step back, essentially zoom out and say, we are not going to fix this just by removing a bit of friction here and there. That's amazing. Or another one that I like is Capital One. I remember being at AWS reInvent, I think it was 2015, so quite a few years ago. And the CIO at Capital One went on stage and said, all new applications will be built on AWS, and we're going to shut down our data centers in that order. And I don't know if I dreamed it or not, but I think I saw that slide where you had which data centers would be shut down, like 2016, 17, 18, 19. And that makes things very factual, and it makes it like, okay, I'm not kidding. We're shutting them down. So figure it out. And those type of very strong messages it takes courage, and that's amazing. By the way, I talk about cloud here. I hope it's clear that if you're going to the cloud and don't do CI, CD, or DevOps, you're in the wrong line of work probably. And the last one, if you will know, Sean, is an example that I've seen that I think is amazing. So when you talk to this example takes place, I'm not going to name companies, but in the UK, in the banking sector. And it's a pretty traditional world. It used to be, right? And so the main fear you're getting when you have those stories like, oh, but we want to go fast. We're going to be essentially throwing bad code in production. That's no good. So there is a bit of this fear of speed. And however, there is this thing in the UK where if your application, some of your core application, mobile, banking, and so on, goes offline for more than 30 minutes, then the government agency, the UK regulator, banking regulator, essentially comes and does an in-depth inspection. You don't want to go there, essentially, right? Your life is going to become a disaster. And so then they started playing on this, and they realized, well, actually, by doing small iteration, by frequently going to production, actually, we used to be afraid to have downtime, because a downtime meant a big event. But now they could actually push things to production. And if it goes wrong, that's fine, as long as you stay within the 30 minutes limit. Because then you don't get the big inspection. And so it's not that it doesn't matter if you go down, it still matters, but much, much, much less, as long as you can recover fast. So they started using a lot more things like progressive delivery and continuous delivery and so on, as long as the recovery time was slower than 30 minutes. And so it was a game changer for them, for the teams, for everybody involved. And, so how do you turn a fear into essentially a differentiator?
Right. Well, these are great examples, and I appreciate you both taking the time to explain them. It sounds like, if I was to summarize in many ways kind of what you guys both said and examples you give, the good, essentially, while it may take time, tend to end up getting both the organizational, the strategic, and the practical parts of implementation of DevOps right. Maybe not successful all at the same time, but it sounds like they've gotten 1, 2, and all of these things in succession over time to a point where, they're starting to interplay with each other, which leads me to my next question. And I always wondered about this. I've heard both of you talk about data passionately. Since the moment I've gotten a chance to get to meet you, it's always been on both of your minds, and I think in different ways. And you guys, having seen the examples that you guys just gave of some challenges and some great stories around DevOps implementation, both somehow arrived either together or separately, I'm not sure. Would love to hear that story from you guys. But Kohsuke, beginning with you, when did you guys kind of get that idea that, wait a second, this data is being accumulated, it can be used for DevOps, but we're currently not using it? And what role that would eventually play for you guys. So Kohsuke, to you first, when did that thought first come into your mind after you had started Hudson and Jenkins project, and how have you seen this grow over time?
Sure. So, I think the key part of it is I through Jenkins, I pushed a lot of automation forward in the world. So I'm seeing a lot of people doing a lot of work there, but only to see basically all the results thrown away, except for one bit of information, which is, whether this is green or red. So I felt like, that's kind of unfortunate. And two, because when I was working for Sacha, I struggled mightily to get the people, get the resources for the product, the product side of the org. And then, whereas the sales and marketing are a lot more meticulous and number driven, and they were using that to effectively tell a story. It wasn't like the numbers work on their own, like that combined with the narrative told a very convincing story. And I realized that the engineering product is not doing that. So I felt like, well, that's also a fail on our side. And the third, this was around the time the big data was the thing. And maybe it's still a thing as a buzzword. So where this realization that the data, when amassed at the critical amount, can have this game-changing quality. And developers used to think, well, so we are on the side of disruption, we are driving change in the world. But I started to thinking, well, the way we work also should be impacted by it. So it's kind of like a combination of those three factors.
Yeah. So if I got it right, you saw it from the get-go through Jenkins, but you were seeing that its implementation and use was generally just a red and green status outlet, but you were thinking, there's a lot more data here. There's a narrative associated with it, and what is that narrative? What is the story in the background?
Yeah, exactly.
All right. So if I think about that, a lot of people would say that perhaps The biggest challenge for us to find the narrative, though, is that data is so distributed. Data is so, siloed across our tool chain. So, Launchable has a very practical example of using data to learn, build up a learned set of data associated with testing and the code and the correlation between the two. But in a much more strategic sense, do you think that that challenge is still there, Kohsuke, with data being so disconnected and siloed across so many tool chains, that finding that narrative is practically hard? Or have we arrived at a point where we can go past that?
You're right that the data is available in different places. And again, I think of all the places in marketing, it's probably the most evident. But anyway, so there's a lot of things we could do if you're connecting together pieces of information from different sources. And I believe that's one of the things CloudBees is thinking about a lot. But I right now I'm thinking more about what is a right alignment of stars where I can kind of make an impact, and I'm feeling like I can do it without trying to pierce together a lot of information. So I'm aiming a lot lower at the moment, and I think this is a big space that allow angles from different starting points. I think eventually it will converge. But just like I said, it's just that people mostly just throwing away the whole thing. So anything we can do is a massive improvement as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, no, I totally understand, and I couldn't agree more. Your approach to it is, yes, you recognize and see and realize that there's a lot of data out there, but in practicality, let's take one step at a time.
Yeah, imagine one thing.
And get the use.
Yeah,
I think too, Sean, is part of our value proposition is we really want to test what matters. We're not necessarily suggesting that you should test everything. I think one of the, as marketers, one of the traps we can fall into is we can overanalyze tens of thousands of different data streams, and we could spend our whole day just looking at pieces of data. And Launchable's value prop is really around, okay, we have the tsunami of data. We know we can't focus on all of it. Let's really focus on what's going to matter and what's going to push things forward. And so I think I think I want to bring us back to, it's more about testing what matters and focusing on what's most important.
Yeah. Now, Sacha, obviously I've been at CloudBees working with you for nearly 3 years, but I know that the concept of data at CloudBees predates me entirely. And CloudBees has had an eye on utilizing that data to both strategically and practically make DevOps better, stronger, both practically and strategically. I know that. So kind of same question to you, sort of in your mind, when did that idea come around and how do you think about it today and how do you think it will be used?
Yeah, it's interesting because it's almost as if in the first wave, quote unquote, of DevOps, it was a lot more around team effort, right? Local effort. And I think data, at least initially, was a lot less interesting because you know what's going on. And data is not necessarily going to give you much more than all of the work you need to do to get to decent automation, for example, right? However, as the organization start having more, not just one team, 5 teams or 10 teams, but it becomes a practice for the organization, you're essentially moving a bit from the DevOps as an art to DevOps as a science. And that's where data becomes very interesting because Jan at the start of the call was talking about how, if every company is a software company, what does it mean? Well, yeah, he's right. If everybody is a software company, guess what? We have ERPs for accounting, we have CRMs for marketing. What's a system of record for software delivery? How do we track our DNA, our software DNA? Because we're producer of software. And so that needs to be reflected somewhere and not just in code. And that's where I think the science become really interesting, is how you can leverage that data to analyze and understand who are you, what's your DNA. And what I think is interesting with approaches like Launchable is that it's almost as if we're going back to the teams, because you go like from art to science, you've got this big maelstrom of data, but then Kohsuke and the team are like, well, wait, we can still make sense of data now that the teams are secure, the team have done good work, because the next iteration of going fast will not just require smart engineer to write good pipelines and good automation. At some point, the inherent complexity of things makes it hard. And if you can get a co-pilot, an AI co-pilot to come and say, well, let me take a look and look at all of those tests and things and tell you, well, I actually think you don't need to do that, but you should focus on that. That's amazing, right? But it's funny how we're constantly going back from team to org-wide, and so we solve it for the organization, and then go back to solving things for teams. And I'm not saying that Launchable can't be used for an organization at large, but I see the applicability of data for a team, and that's pretty unique, because that's not something we could do initially.
Yeah, I always kind of wanted to make this. I mean, it's easy to make data a thing about the management, but I also know, like, I think about my colleagues, like developer colleagues, and they also hate the idea of getting measured and how many lines of code you produced a week, things like that. And while, because after I became CTO, I sort of started to appreciate what the measurement can do for the boss to get more resources for that organizations. But so for the land, I wanted to show that the data can actually help us, the developers, like, the first and the foremost. And as a side effect, we also, get a good story for the boss. So that's why, I intentionally said, okay, what are the things that the developers suffer every day that we can make better?
Yeah, well, it's a great point, Kohsuke, because it's we tend to forget that a lot, if maybe not 100%, but a lot of the data that we can capture in DevOps about efficiency, performance, and whatever, it's relative data. It's not absolute data. It's not like, oh, you're a 6 and he's a 2. Obviously, a lot of companies have tried to put those metrics in place, but you can ask any engineer, compute a score, and you're going to feel this uneasiness that Kohsuke was talking about, because like, okay, but I'm going slow here because actually this is a mainframe application. I'm limited in how fast I can go, or the architecture sucks. So, okay, you're going to tell me I'm a 2 out of 10 because the architecture sucks. So maybe you want to talk to the architecture team, or, it's not one thing. And so I think it's a lot more interesting to see the evolution over time, or to use that as a way to say, okay, you need to double click here because there might be a mean to improve things. But there is this fear, and I think it's a correct fear, that it might be used as absolute data, and you just look at velocity and you're like, oh, you're a slow person, you're a fast person. That's a little bit more complicated than that.
Yeah. That makes sense. I mean, yes, because my next question would just essentially be, if you think about ML, AI in terms of approachability, that would be one of the things that would limit sort of the approachability, because you kind of think about that data and so on as a purely a measurement framework. But I assume, and I would hope, that essentially the use of data in DevOps is not for that particular purpose only, but in fact has a much broader use case that isn't so much about measuring individuals or and so on and so forth, but in fact understanding patterns, understanding and teaching ourselves where we falter, teaching ourselves where we win, teaching ourselves sort of how one thing is correlated to another, so we can constantly see sort of the value production be successful and see places where we can optimize them. But with that in mind, I mean, I want to thank both of you guys for sharing so openly about sort of these thoughts. I would like to just ask Kohsuke, though, practically, what does that look like? What you guys have done with machine learning? Because I hear that very often, that perhaps the biggest barrier to bringing ML and data into the equation for DevOps is our ability to understand what it is. And you guys have packaged it into a use case. You have the ability to train the system. What does this practically look like? Is that something you can show here on the show today?
So the thing about what we do is one way to describe it, it's almost invisible, right? So this is one of our sample project, and here's like a one guy, I guess making a change to the code. So like everyone, you'd have a CI pipeline. So let's look at what the CI pipeline looks like, it's building. So it's building and running the test and doing all the usual stuff. Now, the way Launchable kicks in is like it just intersects with the build tool. In this case, it's Gradle. So where is it running Gradle here? So it's eventually running Gradle. So here it is. But we interact with it a little bit and then basically specify the tests that it wants to run. So in other words, in this case, this project, imagine this project has a huge number of tests, like tens of thousands, like Jenkins project has. And then depending on the area of the change, in this case, he has modified add.java, like it picks up the right area to test. And then, if that contains a failure, it gets rejected. So, if somebody is just looking at it from outside, like if you're just a developer working on this code base without understanding any of the delivery pipeline, you didn't see any changes. It's just that except for the fact that your broken change gets rejected faster. So that's a kind of key value prop. But behind the scene, we are collecting all this data, so that can be used later to drive more insights and actions. So these are all the test runs that has happened, and then getting the results are getting collected. And from there, we can reveal some insights. So here you see things like the trend of the test execution time over time. You see the sudden drop. So guess what happened? We installed Launchable. So the test time went down.
That was Launchable. Yeah. That was Launchable right there.
Exactly. Okay. So when the boss and the CTO needs to tell CEO that, hey, this year money was well spent. This right there is the money well spent. And then the frequency going up, and the similar story, right? So these are the kind of narrative part that they described earlier that the individual developers might not care about, but the organizational leaders can use it to rally more resources around. Or the people who are trying to drive more practice of tests. Like there are a lot of organizations who's trying to push for more tests. They need to show the impact that they're making without waiting for the whole year or that sort of thing. So we can give you that. Or a little more closer to the developers. Like every developer has this challenge. Well, every test suite rather has this challenge that some tests are flaky. And those flaky failures create noise in the process and, erodes the confidence. So we can, by using a little bit of math, I'm glad I got the education in the college and graduate school on this topic. We can give people the flakiness scores. Again, this is developers in the team kind of knows that some tests are flaky and they want to fix those. What they are not good at is making a good case why fixing those flaky tests is worth their time. Because there are other people wanting their time to be spent on other things. So again, this is giving us them the ammo that, hey, these are the impact that it's creating, that it's worthwhile fixing those, here at the top, but maybe not all of those flaky failures, and then seeing the impact when they make the change. And finally, the insights need to lead to actions like that. So we show the action in this case was a predicted test selection. So by selecting the right subset, we are able to reduce the test execution time from say 40 minutes down to 9 minutes, etc. So again, you can show the impact, the amount of time that you were able to save for developers, which is quite costly. So that's generally the kind of things we try to do. So I hope it kind of gives our mental, frame of where we are.
Yeah, it's phenomenal. It looks like you've taken a great machine learning use case that can be applied to a very practical use case, and you've made it approachable. It's not like you're saying, hey, dear developer, go learn a whole statistics class. You've packaged it into a much more approachable sense. And I think I'll make a claim, and if I can, that I think that's the key, right? I think that's the key for CloudBees. It's the key for Launchable, and for anybody really in the market, any company that's trying to bring machine learning to the masses. It's certainly not just collecting the data and saying, developer, go take a statistics class and learn how to do, regression formulas now to predict or to forecast models. But in fact, packaging them in such a way that we can be removed from the complexities of the statistics, but still be able to apply its insight in the way that you have done here, whether that's training data the system learns by itself with easy input from developers, whether it's much more higher level, but packaging them by use case, making them useful, that's, I think, going to be the keys.
Yeah.
Sacha, what do you think? Kohsuke, what do you think? Is that a too bold a prediction from me that's what is going to be the key? Or how do
like Sacha was saying earlier, I think the developers, when they hear the word data and measurement, they think of this as their performance measurement, like that they impact their salary or bonus or whatever. But I think what I'm trying to show is like, look, this is the tool that you can use to get what you want, which is things like fixing flaky tests. Like you know what you want. But we help you make the case to your boss who doesn't share the same, like intuition. Numbers has that power.
I have a question for you, Kohsuke, because you said before, or Jan was saying before, we went from 6 weeks to 4 weeks of training the model before you can get some results and so on. And we're at a time where people are impatient, right? They want to try a new tool, click, done, works, don't like, right? And that's it. And you're obviously aiming for a different time frame. And so what can you tell people, so that they have the patience and persistence to hold on, right? Give it a try, stick for 4 to 6 weeks, and you'll see. But what's your story here?
Yeah, so actually, that is a problem, and then so we solved it by delivering what we call the day one model. So now we can start making impact on day 1, day 2, and so on and onward. So it rapidly shoots up, and then it gets to like a really what I think of like a steep peak state in 4 weeks or so. So. Yeah, now we are telling people like you don't have to wait for the whole 4 weeks. You start to see impact on the next day.
Okay. All right, and why does it take? Maybe I'm double clicking a bit on the bits and bytes here, but why do you need to wait 4 weeks? Because you need enough coverage, or what's the story behind?
Yeah, so I mean, for the model, I mean, this is the challenge of the data. I mean, the machine learning in general, like you need to amass a critical mass of data to, one, to train the model and evaluate the model so that it's making the right impact. So I don't see how to fundamentally work around that. That it's like, we bridge this early stage in different ways. But yeah, so. I think you're right, Sacha, that in the day of instant gratification, this is challenging. But at the same time, when you think about most of the projects that are running successfully, we're talking years. So, being able to make an impact on projects like that is a huge deal, even if it takes, a month to get ramped up. And the other thing is in those larger orgs, like if you get things and just going through the process, like, the bureaucracy might be too strong a word, but that takes on its own time. So in the grand scheme of things, I think if you can solve your problem by kicking that can down the road for 4 weeks, I think that's a good deal for most people.
Yeah. Plus, during those 4 weeks, you can just stay put, right? It's not like you need to spin fast on a bicycle or do things. You just set it up, move on to something else, and come back a month after,
exactly.
Right? All right, that I can do.
All right, folks, both of you, I just want to say thank you for coming on the show and talking a little bit about data, AI, and practical versus strategic. I hope our audience takes away the one big message that I think the show has here, which is this is not space rocket science, but in fact, it is practical, it's strategic, and in all of our efforts as we move forward to become companies that do DevOps better, data has got a role to play, and we've got a lot of it. So we found some both practical and strategic ways to use it. And here you have the industry veterans talking about how important it is, and even betting a company like Kohsuke is doing now on the fact that this is going to both practically and strategically with time help developers do their job even better using data. So we're going to end the show here, but we're going to introduce a new segment that we haven't had on the show. I call it the rapid response. So we're going to ask Kohsuke and Sacha a couple of really quick rapid fire questions, and you don't have to explain the answers, but we want a quick yes or a no. All right. So Sacha, Kohsuke, you guys ready for this?
Yeah.
All right. Here we go. Question number one. We'll start with you, Sacha, and then go to Kohsuke. Would you trust artificial intelligence and machine learning for finding a date?
Checking my wife is around, so I think so. Yeah. If I was looking for a date, I mean, anything would do. Personally, I would try anything. What would be interesting is not to look at what would work for you, but maybe what did not work for you, right? So you don't repeat mistakes, because I'm seeing a lot of repetition in dating where people do the same mistakes. So I would say, yeah, let's do it virtually.
All right, virtually. All right, Sacha's all in. Kohsuke, what about you?
Yeah, I think the short answer is yes. I think anything you do, really.
All right, question number two. Would you trust AI to take off, cruise, and land a plane if you were a passenger on it?
So you're saying after I had a huge series of explosion, giving dozens of tons of trust in my butt, like, do I care if it's software or human being piloting the thing?
That's right.
Yeah, I don't care at that point in time. After the explosion, it could be a monkey for all I care.
Well,
Kohsuke?
yes, I mean, the computer is always already flying the airplane and landing it, so like it's already done. Like that problem is solved. Next.
All right. That problem is solved. Let's make it a little bit closer to home. Would you trust it to cook your eggs in the morning?
So I'm not a big egg person. I like eggs, but I'm not a great cook. So I would say yes, it can only be better.
Okay.
Well, it's probably too trivial a problem that for AI. So I say no because it lacks my lab. I think it's the cooking is lab.
Okay. No for you. Our first disagreement between Sacha and Kohsuke here is whether or not AI will cook your eggs for you or not. All right. Would you trust it to perform surgery?
Yes, I think so. But I would love to have somebody next to the robot in case it goes a bit sideways. Like, I like the idea of a backup plan.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I'm thinking in general, yes, but no, if I think about it operating on me, so I guess no, I have to say no. Yeah.
No. All right. Would you trust AI to write production code?
Yeah, I think that's what we call a Tesla.
Yes, I think breaking code is okay. So yes, I trust AI to write code.
All right. So we trust it there. What about letting AI teach your children?
I'd be worried personally because we've seen AI do a lot of pretty edgy stuff at time. It doesn't know necessarily the right notion of boundaries and so on. So I'd still be worried on that front.
I'm sure it can be AI assisted. So I guess it depends on the degree. So I think we can use more of it than we use today. So I guess from that sense, I'll say yes.
All right. Well, let's ask the final one. And this is going to sound a little like Terminator, Skynet-like, but do we believe that AI could surpass human intelligence?
Well, the big question is, can AI be sentient, right? And think and have emotion? Until that day, it's going to be great at solving specific problems, but it's not going to be any competitive per se directly. But if one day we get there, wow, it's going to, what does it mean, right? If you shut down your computer, did you just commit murder, or how does that work? I don't know. I have no clue.
Well, if you're talking, since there's no associated time span here, I think the betting on the yes side is probably a more better deal. Right? We are not getting any smarter. The computer seems to be, so yeah. It'd be great.
All right, folks. Thank you, Ian. Thank you, Sacha. Thank you, Kohsuke, for being on the show. We really had fun talking about this topic. I'm sure this will be not the last episode talking about data and ML and AI, and that's how it's being used in DevOps. For those of you who've seen the Steve Wozniak episode, this Chris Skinner episode, this topic keeps coming up over and over again. So I don't think it's the last one, but I want to appreciate your time for listening and to the guests that came on the show today. And we wish you all the best in your DevOps efforts. See you in a month. Take care and goodbye.
Thank you, Sean. You're a great host.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sean.
DevOps Radio is a production of CloudBees, Foxdog Consultants, and lived and produced. This show is produced by Sneha John, Adam Jaffe, Brian Prey, Dave Spalding, Lisa Bergqvist, and Sean Ahmed. You can find us on iTunes, Apple Podcasts, and cloudbees.com. Make sure to follow, subscribe, and rate with a big 5 stars on your favorite podcast app, and follow CloudBees and your host, Sean Ahmed, on all social media channels. We've got links to everything in the show notes. All of us at CloudBees are here to help practitioners create better DevOps for all. So go out and build great stuff.